It's Zelda month, everyone! Introduced by Peanut Butter Gamer, a yearly tradition where we use November to express our love for one of Nintendo's best franchises. And as I did last year, I want to join the party as well. Back then, I looked at the original Legend of Zelda and discussed if it is still as much fun to play as it was back in the day. But today I want to take it to an entry that's mostly overlooked and not as much spoken about as other games in the franchise. Zelda II: The Adventure of Link. This game mixed up the gameplay a lot from the original, and it was pretty difficult, which might be why it's off-putting for a lot of people today. If you have a Nintendo Switch Online subscription and you want to try it out, then you can find it in the NES library of games. But beware, it isn't very similar to other Zelda games you've played. As most Zelda games, except for the 3D games of course, handled a more top-down perspective in some way. But Zelda II opts to go for the 2D action-adventure game. It has a leveling system with which you are able to level up your health, magic or attack after gaining enough experience points. So if you can't really progress, you can always do some grinding to level up, which works pretty nicely. It would be one of the first games with an open world where you can interact with NPCs and do some questing to get new items. But after this game, they decided to scrap the 2D idea and go back to the classic format. And after that, we haven't seen the 2D format anymore. Unless you count the CDI games. But we don't count those now, do we? But even though the game has been overshadowed by its younger siblings, doesn't mean that it must be totally forgotten, as this game did many things which would later become very important aspects to the Legend of Zelda series. If you played Link's Awakening on Switch, you can find one of those aspects in the dungeons. Because even though they would not return to a full game which would be a 2D platformer, some segments in Link's Awakening would incorporate that to mix up the gameplay. To be honest, it works really well. It's a nice change of pace where you can experience the game from another perspective. Speaking of dungeons, in Zelda II these were called palaces, which had some amazing music with all new tracks that we hadn't heard before. These themes would not be used often in future Zelda games, but where we did find these soundtracks was in Super Smash Bros. Melee, where they were used for the Hyrule Temple level, which would be my first interaction with that music. It was very well fitting for one of the best stages in Melee. With Smash also being in 2D, Link would also use some moves from Zelda 2 in his moveset, like the down stab and the crouch stab. But action wasn't the only thing other Zelda games would take inspiration from. Like I said, the towns and people would be something that many Zelda games would incorporate as well. But not only Zelda games. Now I won't claim that The Adventure of Link would be the very first game mixing platforming with RPG elements, but it was certainly one of the very first in the genre. And many other games took inspiration from that, mostly on the NES, like Moon Crystal, the Battle of Olympus and Faxanadu. And if you play The Adventure of Link and the town names seem familiar to you, then you probably played Ocarina of Time as well. Because the sages in that game were named after the towns in Zelda 2, like Rudo, Saria and Darunia. You will also find a town called Mido, who wasn't a sage, but he was a freaking annoying guy in the Kokiri forest. And if we look at the Zelda timeline, we will see that The Adventure of Link takes place after Ocarina of Time. So in canon, the towns were named after the sages instead of vice versa. The title, however, is also interesting, as it would become the only game that wouldn't bear the Legend of Zelda in its name. Instead, it would just use Zelda II: The Adventure of Link. The enemies would be quite unique, and not everything that we saw here would return later. But one very important guy would come back many times after this game. Dark Link, or Shadow Link. A menacing fighter that mimics Link's behavior that's difficult to beat. He even appeared in the recent Link's Awakening, where you can spawn him with the amiibo from that game. Sadly, Zelda 2 would be considered as a failure by series creator Shigeru Miyamoto, as he thought that they were limited by the capability of the hardware. Maybe that's why we don't hear often anymore about this game. You have to understand that Miyamoto's plans for the sequel were much bigger than you can play right now. But there is only so much that you can do with the NES hardware. The original was of course hugely popular, selling 6.51 million copies on the NES alone. While Zelda 2 only managed to sell 4.38 million copies. Still an impressive feat, but unfortunately also significantly less than its predecessor. But it's great to see that still after all this time, Zelda 2 has left a considerable impact on the franchise. And like I said, if you want to try it out, you can play it in the NES library on Switch right now. And if you hunger for more 2D Zelda action, then you have to purchase a CDI system, which I wouldn't recommend. And if you like The Legend of Zelda and Nintendo in general, then be sure to subscribe to the XPref channel for much more goodness on these topics. I want to wish you a very happy Zelda month, and I hope to see you next time.